The electromagnetic pulse hit at 3:47 hours, turning the Nevada sky into a canvas of unnatural green fire. Every piece of electronic equipment within a 50-mile radius died instantly. Radar screens went black, communication systems fell silent, and the sprawling military installation plunged into darkness. In the command bunker 300 feet underground, General Morrison stood frozen before a wall of dead monitors, his weathered face illuminated only by emergency lighting. "Sir, we've lost everything," whispered Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, his voice barely audible in the sudden mechanical silence that had replaced the constant hum of sophisticated warfare technology. "Satellite uplinks, ground control, even the backup generators are fried." Morrison's jaw tightened. The EMP device, an experimental weapon designed by their own research division, had exceeded every projection. What was meant to be a controlled test in an isolated sector had somehow amplified beyond comprehension, creating a dead zone that stretched across 3 states. But that wasn't the worst part. "What about Nighthawk 7?" Morrison asked, though he already knew the answer would haunt him. Hayes consulted a paper manifest, one of the few information sources still functioning. Major Katarina "Ghost" Volkov. She was conducting final approach testing in the F-35C Lightning when the pulse hit. Her aircraft was approximately 12 miles from ground zero. The silence stretched like a held breath. Everyone in that bunker understood the physics. No modern fighter jet could survive a direct EMP hit. The fly-by-wire systems would fail instantly, leaving the pilot in a $30 million coffin falling from 20,000 feet. Even if the pilot survived the initial system failure, the aircraft would become uncontrollable, spiraling toward Earth with the inevitability of gravity itself. "She's gone," Morrison stated flatly, the words hitting the concrete walls like a judge's gavel. No one could survive that EMP. But 16 hours later, as the first dawn light crept across the devastated landscape, something impossible appeared on the horizon. A single contrail, straight and purposeful, cutting through the morning sky like a silver blade. Ground crews who had been manually operating equipment with flashlights and hand tools stopped their work, shielding their eyes against the rising sun. The aircraft approaching their position moved with the fluid precision of a predator, its engine singing a song that every military aviator recognized, the distinctive whine of a fighter jet in perfect control. As it grew larger against the orange sky, the impossible became undeniable. Someone had not only survived the unsurvivable, but was flying home with the confidence of a pilot who had never doubted her return. Major Katarina Volkov was about to remind everyone why some legends refuse to die quietly in the desert dawn, and why the sky belongs to those brave enough to claim it. The radio crackled to life with a voice that would change everything they thought they knew about survival, determination, and the indomitable spirit of a woman who had just rewritten the rules of modern aerial warfare. Her call sign wasn't chosen randomly. It reflected something deeper about her ability to appear where others saw only empty sky and impossible odds. Ghost was coming home, and she had a story that would reshape military aviation forever. The general's certainty about survival had just encountered the one variable he never calculated: the unbreakable will of a pilot who refused to accept defeat, even when physics itself seemed stacked against her. In the growing light of that desert morning, legend was about to collide with reality, and neither would ever be the same again. Static filled the emergency frequency before her voice cut through with crystal clarity. "Tower, this is Ghost. Request permission to land. I have some interesting data to share about EMP survival protocols." Morrison's hand trembled as he reached for the microphone, his previous declaration echoing in his mind like a challenge that had just been definitively answered by the approaching thunder of jet engines and the unwavering courage of one extraordinary pilot. The morning sun painted her contrail gold against the endless Nevada sky, a testament to human ingenuity triumphing over impossible circumstances. What happened next would become the foundation of a new chapter in military aviation history, written by a woman whose determination proved stronger than any electromagnetic pulse ever conceived. But first she had to land. Major Katarina Ghost Volkov had earned her call sign during her third deployment in Eastern Europe, where her uncanny ability to appear behind enemy aircraft had saved countless Allied lives. Born in rural Alaska to a bush pilot father and an electrical engineer mother, she had grown up understanding both the poetry of flight and the harsh mathematics of survival. Her childhood was spent in cockpits of small aircraft, learning to read weather patterns in cloud formations and mechanical stress in engine vibrations. The Air Force Academy had been her escape route from a life of subsistence living, but more importantly, it became her proving ground. While her male classmates focused on raw aggression and competitive superiority, Katarina developed something more valuable, an intuitive understanding of aircraft systems that bordered on supernatural. Instructors watched in amazement as she could diagnose mechanical problems by the subtle changes in engine harmonics, predict weather shifts by reading atmospheric pressure through her aircraft's behavior. Her rise through the ranks hadn't been smooth. Military aviation remained a boys' club where competence was questioned, and achievements attributed to luck or favoritism. She had endured endless speculation about her qualifications, subtle sabotage of her equipment, and outright hostility from peers who saw her presence as a political statement rather than earned position. Each slight only sharpened her focus, transforming doubt into fuel for perfectionism that would eventually save her life. The F-35C Lightning II became her mechanical soulmate, an aircraft so complex that most pilots relied entirely on computer assistance for basic flight operations. But Katarina had spent countless hours studying every circuit, every backup system, every redundancy built into the most sophisticated fighter jet ever created. While other pilots trusted technology blindly, she maintained an intimate relationship with her aircraft's mechanical heart. That relationship would prove crucial when the electromagnetic pulse turned her sophisticated war machine into a high-altitude glider. In those first terrifying seconds after the EMP hit, as every digital display went dark and fly-by-wire controls went dead, most pilots would have panicked. The F-35's computer-dependent design made manual flight theoretically impossible. The aircraft was never intended to fly without electronic assistance. But Katarina had prepared for the impossible. During off-duty hours, she had practiced manual control scenarios that other pilots dismissed as academic exercises. She understood the aircraft's center of gravity, its aerodynamic characteristics, the precise mechanical relationships between control surfaces and flight dynamics. When electrons stopped flowing through circuits, she still had physics, instinct, and 20 years of flying experience. The pulse had hit during her final approach phase, when most of her aircraft systems were already configured for landing. This positioning became her salvation: engines at stable thrust settings, aircraft in balanced flight configuration, altitude sufficient for emergency procedures. As darkness claimed her cockpit displays, she immediately switched to emergency manual control mode, a backup system most pilots had never actually used. Her hands found familiar controls by muscle memory, feeling the aircraft's response through stick pressure and rudder feedback. Without electronic flight management, she became the aircraft's computer, calculating airspeed by engine noise, altitude by atmospheric pressure, navigation by dead reckoning and landmark recognition. The girl who had learned to fly by watching her father navigate Alaskan wilderness without GPS suddenly found those primitive skills invaluable at 20,000 feet. What followed was 16 hours of the most challenging flying in military aviation history, a solo endurance test that would redefine what human pilots could accomplish when technology failed completely. The first challenge was fuel management. Without digital fuel quantity indicators, Katarina had to estimate consumption by flight time, engine performance, and aircraft weight distribution. She reduced throttle to minimum sustainable settings, trading speed for endurance while maintaining enough altitude for emergency landing options. The F-35's efficient engines, designed for extended combat operations, became her lifeline in ways the designers never anticipated. Navigation proved equally challenging. With GPS systems dead and inertial navigation computers offline, she relied on pilotage, visual navigation using ground landmarks, sun position, and magnetic compass readings. The Nevada desert landscape, normally featureless and disorienting, became her roadmap. She identified mountain ranges, distinctive rock formations, and human-made structures that appeared on her memorized sectional charts. But the most difficult aspect was psychological. 16 hours alone in a cockpit with no communication, no external confirmation of position or condition, no backup assistance if something went wrong. The silence was absolute. No radio chatter, no ground control guidance, no electronic confirmation that anyone knew she existed. She could have been the last pilot alive, flying through a world where technology had permanently failed. Yet solitude had always been her strength. Growing up in Alaska's wilderness had taught her to find peace in isolation, to trust her own judgment when no other opinions were available. The cockpit became a meditation chamber where she could focus entirely on flight, on the subtle conversations between pilot and aircraft that electronic systems often masked. As hours passed, she began to appreciate the pure flying experience, the direct mechanical connection between her intentions and the aircraft's response, the immediate feedback from control surfaces, the intimate understanding of her machine's capabilities and limitations. This was flying as the Wright brothers had envisioned it, human intelligence merged with mechanical precision, unfiltered by computer interpretation. She used the time productively, mentally cataloging every system failure, every workaround, every lesson learned from manual flight operations. This wasn't just survival, it was research that would revolutionize pilot training and aircraft design. Every hour of flight time was gathering data that no simulation could replicate, insights into human-machine interface that would influence military aviation for decades. When dawn finally appeared on the horizon, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber, she had successfully completed the longest unassisted manual flight in modern fighter aircraft history. But more importantly, she had proven that human pilots remained irreplaceable, even in an age of artificial intelligence and automated systems. The landing approach would be her final test. Without ground control assistance, instrument landing systems, or electronic approach aids, she would have to execute a visual approach relying entirely on depth perception, spatial awareness, and manual control skills. The runway appeared ahead like a narrow ribbon stretched across the desert floor, its proportions difficult to judge without electronic distance measuring equipment. She configured the aircraft for landing approach, lowering landing gear and adjusting engine thrust by sound and feel rather than digital readouts. The F-35's tendency toward high approach speeds, normally managed by computer systems, required constant attention to prevent overshooting the runway. Every control input was calculated and deliberate, with no electronic safety nets to prevent pilot error. Ground crews who had been working with manual equipment throughout the night stopped their activities to watch the approaching aircraft. Word had spread through the base that someone was flying, an impossibility that challenged everything they understood about EMP effects on modern military equipment. Binoculars and improvised observation equipment appeared as personnel gathered to witness what many assumed would be their final glimpse of Major Volkov. The landing gear extended properly, a relief that confirmed mechanical backup systems had survived the electromagnetic pulse. Hydraulic systems, protected by shielding and redundancy, continued operating normally. The aircraft's basic mechanical components remained functional. It was only the electronic brain that had been temporarily paralyzed. Her approach speed was higher than normal, compensating for the lack of electronic flight envelope protection that typically prevented dangerous flight configurations. She held the aircraft in a stable descent profile, making minor corrections for wind drift and runway alignment using visual references and instinctive spatial awareness developed through decades of flying experience. The touchdown was firm but controlled main landing gear, contacting the runway with the authoritative thump of a successful approach. She applied manual braking, feeling the aircraft's deceleration through seat pressure and visual reference points. Without anti-skid systems or electronic brake management, stopping distance became a matter of pilot judgment and mechanical friction. As the F-35 rolled to a stop on the taxiway, ground crews approached cautiously, unsure whether the aircraft's systems might still pose electrical hazards. Emergency vehicles positioned themselves nearby, ready for any complications from the unprecedented landing. Katarina shut down the engines using manual procedures, listening to the familiar wind-down sequence that signaled the end of her extraordinary flight. The silence that followed was profound. No cooling fans, no electronic systems cycling, no radio chatter. Just the natural sounds of metal cooling and desert wind across aircraft surfaces. She remained in the cockpit for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what she had accomplished and preparing to face the questions that would inevitably follow. 16 hours of manual flight in the world's most sophisticated fighter aircraft represented a paradigm shift in understanding human pilot capabilities. Ground crew members approached the aircraft with unprecedented reverence. The canopy opened with a mechanical hiss, revealing Major Katarina Volkov to a crowd of personnel who had spent the night believing she was dead. Her flight suit showed the physical toll of 16 hours in a cramped cockpit, but her eyes held the calm confidence of someone who had just redefined the possible. As she removed her helmet, revealing close-cropped auburn hair and the unmistakable expression of a pilot who had just completed the flight of her career. "Ma'am, are you injured?" asked Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the senior enlisted member approaching the aircraft. His voice carried a mixture of relief and disbelief that reflected the emotions of everyone present. "Negative, Chief. Aircraft is mechanically sound. All major systems responded normally under manual operation. I'll need maintenance to perform a complete inspection, but she flew beautifully once we got past the electronic issues." Her voice was steady, professional, treating the impossible as routine in the way that only exceptional pilots could manage. The ground crew began standard post-flight procedures, but nothing about this situation was standard. They were examining an aircraft that had accomplished something unprecedented in military aviation history. Every system would be analyzed, every component tested, every aspect of the flight documented for future reference and training applications. General Morrison arrived within minutes, his staff car kicking up dust clouds as it approached the flight line. He emerged from the vehicle looking like a man who had just witnessed a fundamental shift in his understanding of military capabilities. The confident declaration he had made 16 hours earlier, that no one could survive the EMP, now seemed like the words of someone who had underestimated both technology and human determination. "Major Volkov," he said, approaching the aircraft with the careful respect reserved for pilots who had just accomplished the impossible. "I believe we owe you a debriefing, and possibly an apology for writing you off prematurely." She climbed down from the cockpit with the fluid movements of someone accustomed to emerging from confined spaces, her boots hitting the tarmac with a solid impact that seemed to emphasize her return to Earth. "Sir, with respect, you didn't write me off. You made an assessment based on available data. I just happened to have access to some additional variables." The exchange represented more than military courtesy. It was a recognition that assumptions about pilot limitations and aircraft capabilities had been fundamentally challenged. The EMP test had intended to demonstrate electronic warfare vulnerabilities, but instead had revealed human adaptability that no computer simulation had predicted. "How did you maintain control without fly-by-wire systems?" Morrison asked, his question reflecting genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. "Manual reversion mode, sir. The F-35 has mechanical backup systems that most pilots never train with because they're considered emergency-only options. I've always believed that understanding your aircraft means knowing every system, including the ones you hope never to use." Her answer revealed the methodical preparation that had made survival possible. While other pilots focused on mastering advanced electronic systems, she had maintained proficiency in fundamental flying skills that seemed obsolete in the digital age. The debriefing would take days, involving teams of engineers, test pilots, and military strategists eager to understand how manual flight operations could be integrated into modern combat scenarios. But standing on the tarmac in the early morning light, surrounded by personnel who had witnessed something extraordinary, the immediate impact was simpler and more profound. Major Katarina, Ghost, Volkov had demonstrated that human pilots remained irreplaceable, even in aircraft designed around electronic automation. The technical debriefing began 3 hours later in a secure conference room where military officials, aircraft engineers, and electronics specialists gathered to understand how she had accomplished the impossible. The room buzzed with an energy that mixed scientific curiosity with military practicality. Everyone present understood they were documenting a historical event that would influence pilot training and aircraft design for decades. "Let's start with the immediate post-EMP response," said Colonel Martinez, the chief test pilot for the F-35 program. His extensive experience with the aircraft made him particularly interested in understanding how manual systems had functioned without electronic support. "What was your first indication that you had lost fly-by-wire control?" Katarina consulted her handwritten notes, compiled during the flight when digital recording systems were unavailable. At 3:47 hours, all cockpit displays went dark simultaneously. Control stick response changed immediately. Instead of the light, assisted movements typical of fly-by-wire operation, I felt direct mechanical feedback from control surfaces. Engine parameters remained steady, but I lost all digital engine management information. Her methodical recounting revealed the analytical thinking that had enabled survival. Rather than panicking when systems failed, she had immediately shifted into diagnostic mode, assessing what remained functional and what required alternative approaches. "The F-35's manual reversion mode isn't designed for extended flight operations," noted Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead electronics engineer for the program. "Most pilots train on it for less than an hour during their entire careers. How did you maintain aircraft control for 16 hours?" "Manual reversion requires treating the aircraft like a 1960s fighter jet, direct mechanical connections between pilot inputs and control surfaces, with engine management based on throttle position and visual auditory feedback rather than computer optimization." She paused, organizing her thoughts before continuing. The key was understanding that the F-35, despite its electronic sophistication, retains excellent basic flying characteristics when flown manually. This insight represented a fundamental shift in understanding modern fighter aircraft capabilities. Military planners had assumed that electronic systems were so integral to F-35 operations that manual flight was essentially impossible beyond basic emergency procedures. "Fuel management must have been challenging without digital quantity indicators," observed Commander Jackson, a Navy test pilot familiar with carrier-based F-35 operations. "How did you calculate consumption rates and remaining endurance?" "I used old-school techniques, monitoring flight time, throttle settings, and aircraft performance to estimate fuel burn. The F-35's engines are remarkably efficient when operated at optimal settings, even without computer management. I maintained cruise flight profiles that maximized endurance while keeping enough altitude for emergency landing options. Her answer demonstrated the value of fundamental piloting knowledge that predated computer assistance. While electronic systems provided precise fuel management, experienced pilots could achieve similar results using basic aerodynamic principles and engine performance understanding. The questions continued for hours, covering navigation techniques, communication attempts, system troubleshooting, and emergency procedures. Each answer revealed layers of preparation and expertise that explained how she had survived in situations that should have been fatal. But the most significant revelation came when discussing the psychological aspects of solo flight, without communication or navigation aids. 16 hours alone in a cockpit with no external contact. That's essentially sensory deprivation combined with extreme stress. How did you maintain focus and decision-making capability? Asked Major Williams, the base's flight surgeon. Katarina's response touched on something deeper than technical flying skills. Growing up in Alaska taught me that isolation isn't necessarily threatening, it can be clarifying. Without radio chatter and electronic distractions, I could focus entirely on flying. The aircraft and I had 16 hours to understand each other completely. This statement captured the essence of her extraordinary flight, a return to fundamental pilot-aircraft interaction that modern aviation had largely forgotten. Her survival hadn't just been about technical knowledge. It had required a mental approach that embraced rather than feared the challenge of pure flying. The debriefing concluded with recommendations that would reshape military pilot training and aircraft system, designed for years to come. The implications of Ghost's survival flight extended far beyond individual achievement. Within days, military strategists were analyzing how electronic warfare vulnerabilities could be mitigated through enhanced manual flight training and backup system improvements. The assumption that modern fighter aircraft were helpless without electronic systems had been definitively disproven, opening new possibilities for combat operations in electromagnetically hostile environments. Air Force Chief of Staff General Patricia Hayes arrived at the Nevada test facility 48 hours after the landing to personally review the incident and its strategic implications. Her reputation as a forward-thinking leader who valued innovation over tradition made her the ideal senior officer to evaluate Ghost's recommendations for pilot training reforms. Major Volkov, General Hayes began during their private meeting, your flight has raised questions about how we prepare pilots for electronic warfare scenarios. What changes would you recommend to our training programs? The question represented more than military curiosity. It was a recognition that Ghost's experience had revealed critical gaps in pilot preparation that could affect combat readiness in future conflicts, where electronic systems might be compromised or unavailable. Ma'am, I recommend mandatory manual flight training for all fighter pilots, not just basic familiarity but actual proficiency in flying without electronic assistance. We should also modify aircraft inspection procedures to ensure backup systems receive the same attention as primary electronic components. Her suggestions were practical rather than revolutionary, focusing on skills and knowledge that could be implemented immediately rather than requiring years of development and testing. The F-35 program has invested billions in electronic systems, noted General Hayes. Are you suggesting those systems are inadequate? Not inadequate, ma'am, just not invulnerable. Electronic systems provide tremendous capabilities, but they shouldn't be our only capabilities. Pilots who understand their aircraft mechanically as well as electronically will be more effective in any environment, whether systems are functioning normally or compromised. This balanced perspective avoided criticizing advanced technology, while advocating for comprehensive pilot education that included both modern and traditional flying skills. The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering everything from pilot selection criteria to aircraft design philosophy. By its conclusion, General Hayes had authorized a comprehensive review of fighter pilot training standards and the development of enhanced manual flight curricula that would be implemented across all military aviation programs. But the most significant outcome wasn't institutional. It was personal recognition of Ghost's exceptional contribution to military aviation. Her call sign, earned through combat operations in Eastern Europe, had taken on new meaning after 16 hours of flying that redefined what was possible when human skill met impossible circumstances. Major Volkov, General Hayes concluded, your flight will be studied by military aviators for decades. You've reminded us that technology serves pilots, not the other way around. That's a lesson worth preserving. The meeting ended with handshakes and formal recognition, but the real impact would be measured in training programs, aircraft modifications, and the confidence of pilots who understood that their skills extended beyond pushing buttons and reading digital displays. 3 months later, the first Ghost Protocol manual flight training program began at the Air Force Test Pilot School, named in honor of the pilot who had demonstrated that human expertise remained irreplaceable even in the most technologically advanced aircraft ever built. The program attracted pilots from every military service, eager to develop skills that might save their lives if electronic systems failed in combat. What had begun as an impossible survival situation had evolved into a cornerstone of military aviation education, ensuring that future pilots would be prepared for challenges that technology alone couldn't solve. Major Katarina, Ghost, Volkov continued flying test missions, but her role had expanded beyond individual flights to include developing training standards and aircraft evaluation criteria that emphasized human-machine interface rather than pure technological capability. Her experience had proven that the most sophisticated aircraft remained only as capable as the pilots who flew them. In the vast Nevada sky, where she had spent 16 hours proving the impossible, new pilots now practiced the skills she had demonstrated under the most extreme circumstances. Each training flight honored her legacy while preparing the next generation of military aviators for challenges they might never face, but would be ready to overcome if they did. The electromagnetic pulse that was meant to demonstrate electronic vulnerability had instead revealed human adaptability that no computer could replicate. Ghost's survival had become a testament to the irreplaceable value of skilled, dedicated pilots who understood that flying was both art and science, technology and instinct, individual achievement and collective preparation. Her story spread throughout military aviation communities worldwide, inspiring pilots to develop comprehensive aircraft knowledge and maintain proficiency in fundamental flying skills that electronic systems had obscured but not replaced. The call sign Ghost had earned new respect, not just for stealth and tactical surprise, but for the ability to appear when others had given up hope, to succeed when failure seemed certain, and to demonstrate that human determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Years later, when military historians wrote about the evolution of fighter pilot training in the early 21st century, they would identify Ghost's 16-hour flight as the turning point that restored balance between technological dependence and human capability. Her survival had reminded everyone that the sky belonged to those brave enough to claim it, skilled enough to navigate it, and determined enough to return home regardless of the challenges they encountered. The general had said no one could survive that EMP. Major Katarina Ghost, Volkov had proved that sometimes impossible is just another word for unprepared. Her jet lighting up the horizon that desert morning had illuminated more than just her return. It had shown the way forward for military aviation in an uncertain electronic age. In the end, her greatest victory wasn't surviving the unsurvivable, but inspiring others to believe that with proper preparation, exceptional skill, and unwavering determination, any pilot could write their own impossible story against the endless canvas of sky that calls to those who dare to answer. The legend of Ghost's flight would endure as long as pilots looked up at the sky and wondered what they might accomplish when everything seemed lost, and found the courage to discover that sometimes the most sophisticated navigation system is the human spirit refusing to accept defeat.